October 1, 1966. Eric Clapton was known as God to his fans. He was England's greatest guitarist, and everyone knew it, especially Eric. Then a stranger walked into his concert and asked to play one song. 10 minutes later, Clapton was backstage, chain-smoking, with tears running down his face, saying words he never thought he'd say. "I'm not the best anymore." To understand what happened that night, you need to understand who Eric Clapton was in 1966. He wasn't just famous, he was worshipped. All over London, graffiti appeared on walls saying, "Clapton is God." It wasn't ironic, it wasn't a joke. People genuinely believed that Eric Clapton had reached a level of guitar playing that no one else could touch. He'd made his name with the Yardbirds, left them because they were too commercial, and joined John Mayall's Blues Breakers, where he'd recorded what many considered the greatest British blues album ever made. His tone was perfect, his phrasing was impeccable, his understanding of American blues was deeper than any British musician had achieved. Then he'd formed Cream with Jack Bruce on bass and Ginger Baker on drums. They were a supergroup before that term really existed, and they were about to become the biggest band in England. On October 1, 1966, Cream was scheduled to perform at the London Polytechnic at Regent Street. It was early in their career. They'd only been together for a few months, but the buzz around them was enormous. The venue was packed with musicians, music journalists, and fans who wanted to see what this new band could do. Eric Clapton walked into that venue knowing he was the best guitarist in the room. Hell, he was probably the best guitarist in the country. He had earned that confidence. Years of practice, years of studying the blues masters, years of pushing himself to be better had brought him to this moment. But there was someone else in that venue that night, someone Clapton had never heard of, someone who would change everything. His name was Chas Chandler, and he'd just flown in from New York with a guitarist he discovered playing in Greenwich Village. Chandler had been the bassist for The Animals, a hugely successful British rock band, but he'd quit to become a manager, and the guitarist he'd brought to London was the investment he was betting his entire future on. The guitarist's name was Jimi Hendrix, though he was still going by Jimmy at the time. Chandler had changed the spelling to make it more exotic, more mysterious. Jimmy had only been in London for about a week. He didn't know anyone. He had no reputation. He was just an American who played guitar. Chandler had brought Jimmy to the Cream concert specifically because he knew Eric Clapton would be there. He knew that if Jimmy could impress Clapton, word would spread through the London music scene like wildfire. But first, they had to get Jimmy on stage. Halfway through Cream's set, during a break between songs, Chandler made his move. He walked up to the stage and spoke to Eric Clapton directly. "Eric, I've got a guitarist here from America. He's really good. Would you mind if he sat in for a song?" This was a common enough request in those days. Musicians would often invite other players to join them on stage. It was considered polite, collegial, a way of building community in the music scene. Eric looked at Chandler, then at the man standing behind him. Jimi Hendrix stood quietly, holding a guitar case, not saying anything. He was dressed in a way that immediately marked him as different. Colorful clothes, wild hair, a style that was somewhere between blues musician and bohemian artist. Clapton later admitted that his first thought was mild annoyance. He was in the middle of a great set. Cream was sounding tight. The last thing he wanted was some unknown American disrupting the flow. But his ego wouldn't let him say no, because saying no would seem like he was afraid, and Eric Clapton wasn't afraid of any guitarist. "Sure," Clapton said, with just a hint of condescension in his voice. "What does he want to play?" "How about Killing Floor?" Chandler suggested. Killing Floor was a Howlin' Wolf song, a blues standard that every serious guitarist knew. It was a safe choice, a song where an experienced musician could show what they had without stepping too far outside the expected boundaries. Clapton nodded. "All right, let's hear what he's got." Jimi Hendrix walked onto the stage of the London Polytechnic. The crowd barely noticed him. They were there to see Cream, to see Clapton. This was just some random guy sitting in. Jimmy plugged in his guitar, he made a few adjustments to the amplifier, and then he started to play. What happened over the next 10 minutes would become one of the most legendary moments in rock history. Jimmy didn't just play Killing Floor, he reinvented it. He took that blues standard and turned it into something nobody in that room had ever heard before. His fingers moved across the fretboard in ways that seemed physically impossible. He played with his teeth, he played behind his back, but these weren't just tricks. Every note was perfect, every phrase was musical, every moment was controlled chaos that somehow made complete sense. The sound coming out of his amplifier was unlike anything anyone had experienced. He was using the full range of the electric guitar in a way that British musicians hadn't even conceived of. Feedback wasn't a mistake, it was an instrument. Distortion wasn't something to avoid, it was a tool for expression. The wah and scream of the strings became part of the music itself. Eric Clapton stopped playing about 30 seconds into Jimmy's performance. He just stood there on stage, guitar in his hands, listening. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally something that looked like devastation. Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker, Clapton's bandmates, stopped playing too. The song had become Jimmy's solo, and there was nothing they could do but watch. The crowd, which had been casually enjoying the show, suddenly went completely silent. Then, as they began to understand what they were witnessing, the silence turned into gasps, then murmurs, then finally wild applause that grew louder with each passing moment. Jimmy played for about 10 minutes. When he finished, the crowd erupted. People were on their feet, screaming, applauding, demanding more. Musicians who had seen hundreds of guitarists play were shaking their heads in disbelief. And Eric Clapton quietly walked off stage. He went straight to the backstage area, found a quiet corner, and lit a cigarette. Then another, then another. His hands were shaking. Chaz Chandler, knowing he'd just pulled off something historic, followed Clapton backstage. He found him chain-smoking, staring at the wall. "You never told me he was that fucking good," Clapton said, his voice raw with emotion. Later accounts would say there were tears on his face, though Eric Clapton himself has never confirmed this detail. What Clapton experienced in that moment was something that very few people at the absolute top of their field ever have to face. He'd spent years becoming the best, only to discover in 10 minutes that there was someone out there operating on a completely different level. It wasn't just that Jimmy was good, it was that Jimmy was doing things Clapton hadn't even imagined were possible. It was like Clapton was playing checkers while Jimmy was playing three-dimensional chess. Other musicians started crowding the backstage area. Pete Townshend of The Who was there. Jeff Beck was there. Some of the best guitarists in England had all been in that audience, and they were all processing what they'd just seen. "Did you see that? How did he do that thing with his teeth?"
"Forget the teeth," another musician responded. "Did you hear that tone? How is he getting that sound?" But Eric Clapton wasn't part of these conversations. He was standing alone, smoking, dealing with something much deeper than technical curiosity. His identity had just been shattered. For years, being the best guitarist had been central to who Eric Clapton was. It wasn't vanity, or at least it wasn't just vanity. It was the thing he dedicated his life to. And in 10 minutes, that identity had been challenged in a way he couldn't deny or rationalize away. Eventually, Jimi Hendrix himself came backstage. He was quiet, almost shy. He walked over to where Clapton was standing. "Hey man," Jimmy said softly. "Thanks for letting me play. That was really cool of you." Clapton looked at him, this stranger who'd just turned his world upside down, and saw something he didn't expect. There was no arrogance in Jimmy's face, no triumph, No sense that he'd just defeated anyone. He genuinely seemed grateful for the opportunity to play. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Clapton asked. Jimi shrugged. "I don't know, man. I hear things in my head, and I try to get them out through the guitar." They talked for a while. Clapton asked technical questions. Jimi answered them, but in a way that made it clear he didn't really think in technical terms. He thought in sounds, in feelings, in colors and emotions. As they talked, something shifted in Clapton. The initial devastation began to transform into something else: fascination, respect, and eventually a kind of liberation. Because once Clapton accepted that he wasn't the best anymore, he was free to stop trying to be. He could stop defending a title and start being a student again. He could stop worrying about maintaining his position and start exploring what else was possible. In interviews years later, Clapton would describe that night as one of the most important moments of his career. "It was humbling," he said, "but it was also inspiring. Jimi showed me that the guitar could do things I'd never imagined. He opened doors I didn't know existed." The friendship that began that night lasted until Jimi's death in 1970. Clapton and Hendrix would hang out together, jam together, learn from each other. The competition that could have defined their relationship never materialized, replaced instead by mutual respect and genuine affection. Clapton would later say that Jimi was one of the few people in the world who understood the burden of being considered the best. "People expect things from you," Clapton explained. "They expect you to always be brilliant, to never have an off night, to somehow be superhuman." Jimi understood that pressure. We could talk about it in ways we couldn't talk about it with other people.
When Jimi died in September 1970, Clapton was devastated. They'd had plans to hang out that night. Clapton had been looking forward to seeing him. Instead, he got a phone call telling him that Jimi was gone. Clapton would later record several tributes to Hendrix, including performances of Jimi's songs that showed clear influence from what he'd learned from his friend. And whenever anyone asked Clapton about Hendrix, he would always come back to that night in October 1966. "He changed everything," Clapton would say. "Not just for me, but for everyone. After Jimi, we all had to rethink what the guitar could be." But the impact of that night went beyond just Clapton and Hendrix. Word spread through the London music scene at incredible speed. By the next day, every musician in London had heard about the American guitarist who'd sat in with Cream and blown everyone's mind. Suddenly, Jimi Hendrix had credibility. Chas Chandler's gamble had paid off. Within weeks, they'd formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience, with Mitch Mitchell on drums and Noel Redding on bass. Within months, they had a hit single. Within a year, Jimi Hendrix was one of the most famous musicians in the world. And it all started with that 10-minute performance at the London Polytechnic. For Eric Clapton, October 1st, 1966 marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. He would go on to have an incredibly successful career, forming Derek and the Dominoes, recording Lila, and becoming one of the most respected guitarists in rock history. But he would never again claim to be the best. Instead, he became something more valuable. He became someone willing to learn, willing to be influenced, willing to acknowledge greatness in others. That humility, born in a moment of devastation, made him a better musician and a better person. The story of what happened that night has been told and retold countless times. It's become part of rock mythology. But what often gets lost in the retelling is the grace with which both men handled the situation. Jimi could have been arrogant. He could have used that moment to humiliate Clapton, to establish dominance, to claim the throne. He didn't. He was respectful, grateful, and kind. Clapton could have been resentful. He could have refused to acknowledge Jimi's talent, dismissed him as a showman without substance, protected his ego at all costs. He didn't. He was honest, humble, and open. That's why the story is powerful. It's not just about a changing of the guard or a competition between two great musicians. It's about how we respond when we encounter someone better than us. Do we become defensive and bitter, or do we become curious and inspired? Clapton chose inspiration, and in doing so, he gained a friend, expanded his musical horizons, and created a legacy that was about more than just being the best. The night Jimi Hendrix made Eric Clapton cry wasn't about destruction, it was about transformation. It was about two extraordinary musicians meeting at exactly the right moment and bringing out the best in each other instead of the worst. Today, when guitarists talk about their heroes, both Clapton and Hendrix are on that list. The throne that Clapton supposedly lost that night, it didn't pass to Jimi. Instead, it expanded to hold them both and every other guitarist who's ever pushed the boundaries of what the instrument can do. That's the real legacy of October 1st, 1966. Not that one god was replaced by another, but that the definition of greatness expanded to include multiple voices, multiple approaches, multiple truths. If this story of humility, transformation, and the power of acknowledging greatness in others moved you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that being challenged isn't the end, it's the beginning of something even better. Have you ever met someone who made you rethink everything you thought you knew? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible true stories about the moments that shaped music history.